Chris now is the Presidential Professor of City and Metropolitan Planning in the College of Architecture and Planning at the University of Utah, where he's also the Director of Metropolitan Research Center, Adjunct Professor of Finance in the School of Business, and Co-Director of the Master of Real Estate Development Program. I asked Chris, I said, you know, you're writing, you're traveling, you're lecturing, you're doing the research. Do you have time for teaching? He said, no, I got a full load. I'm doing all the teaching that I usually do. So a busy man, and certainly going to be a great resource to us. Previously, Chris served on the Faculty of Planning and Public Policy at Georgia Tech, where many of us know him from, and also was an adjunct professor of law at Georgia State University. He's conducted pioneer research on smart growth, public facility finance, economic development, and metropolitan development patterns. He's also the author of more than 20 books and 300 other scholarly and professional publications. Without me saying any more about the topic, because Chris is the expert, Chris, we'd love to have you back in Atlanta. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me back. My slideshow presentation was in the University of Utah red before Dan Reuter said, can you change the colors for me, please? So I did. I changed it to Georgia Tech colors. So the Georgia people in the crowd, I'm sorry about that. Not really. I have about a 4-hour presentation I want to give to you today. I'll go about 3 hours of that. My students, many of whom are here, one year gave me the Nobel Prize because I lectured beyond the bell. So let's go through this. I'm going to present to you a lot of interesting information, of course, but a lot of this stuff is brand new that nobody's ever seen before. And in fact, on the front page of USA Today, and the front page, and also on the money page, they give some facts and figures that are actually wrong. And I'll tell you why they're wrong. So before we go into the presentation formally, I'm going to talk about my new book. Actually, Robert Lang at UNLV and I, Robert is the uncle of Marissa Ghani. He and I wrote a book called Megapolitan America. It came out earlier this year, actually late last year. And it talks about how America is reorganizing itself around about 23 definable, discrete, multiple metropolitan regions that we call megapolitan regions. Of course, we have Atlanta here. The Atlanta megapolitan area stretches from Atlanta to North Carolina, to Alabama, over to Athens, south to Macon, and so forth. These are the economic dynamos of the nation's future. So I was perplexed to have $99 million of the mortgage foreclosure money, or whatever money it was, going to not feeding the economic dynamo of this state, but other parts of the state. Well, maybe they need it more than this part of the state, who knows. Now, these 23 megapolitan regions, and I live in one now these days, the Wasatch Range, but you see them all, they're all across the country. The collective land area of these megapolitan areas equals France. Now, France is home to 70 million people, last time I checked. 200 million people live in America's megapolitan areas. So, we need to direct policies in this country, in my view, in Robert Lang's view, we need to direct policies in this country to sustaining and supporting the economic dynamos that these 23 regions are, because this is the nation's future, and these are the nation's drivers of global competitiveness. So let's go on to demographic and economic trends facing this country over the next 20, 30, 40 years, and maybe forever. And I see a lot of you have the slideshow handouts. I'll basically stick to that, given maybe time constraints. I might gloss over a couple slides. But I want to focus on demographic changes primarily, the aging population, minority growth especially. I'm going to touch on economic conditions. Now, 4 years ago, we went into the tailspin, 2008, now it's 2012. It seems that every year, Ben Bernanke of the Federal Reserve says, give us 2 more years. So now we're looking at 2014, when maybe the economy recovers. My guess is 2018 to 2020 before we are back to where we might have been at the tail end of the last decade, let alone the peak of the last decade. We have financial challenges, and we have changing preference patterns among Americans for what kind of homes they want, what kind of neighborhoods they want. Now, the overarching change taking place in this country is demographic change. In 1970, about half of American households had children in them. I'm a baby boom product, so in the 1950s, it was more than half of American households had children in them. By 2030, only 29% of American households will have children in them. By 2030, more than 70% of American households won't have children in them because they've already raised their children, have yet to raise children, or may never raise children. And about 29%, 30% of households will be single-person households. Now, look at this trend line and think about, we're strapped with the zoning codes of the 1960s and 70s and 80s that were designed to meet the reality of this demographic profile. We're moving towards this profile, but we're stuck with that zoning profile. So we're in a time warp in our planning and zoning codes that we find now very difficult to change. Now, it used to be the case in home building that we had 2 things going for us, among many other things, but 2 primary things. Growth. As population increases, we have to build more homes. And declining household size. If we have growth and declining household size, that means we have to build ever more homes to meet the market demand. So in the year 2000, the average household size in the U.S. had fallen to 2.59 persons per household. All the demographers I know said by the year 2010, we'll be at 2.52 people per household. Not a big change, it seems, but it means about 3 million more homes have to be built between 2000 and 2010 to meet just the declining household size, let alone then another 3 million homes, actually 10 million homes, for growth. Funny thing happened on the way to 2010. Household size did not change. Now, maybe it was the recession that caused the lack of decline in household size, but in 2006, at the height of the boom, when we were giving away homes to dogs and cats, household size was 2.6. So household size has suddenly stopped shrinking. And one reason may be that we are seeing another feature of demographic changes taking place. And that is multiple generations staying together in the same household. Now, part of this is driven by immigrant households, but most of it's driven by the fact that as the boomers, me and a lot of you, age along, we may move in with our children or have children move in with us, and not for just economic reasons, but for humanitarian or family reasons, primarily. And so what we're finding is America's housing composition is moving back to where it was a century ago. In 1900, 23% of American households were multi-generational. Mom and dad, the grandparents, and the kids, basically. We saw that carry through to 1940, then we saw the tremendous decline in multiple generational households, down to 12% by 1980, and now we see an ever-increasing trend. 16% in 2008 is going to be, my guess is 20% by 2030. If we have increasing numbers of multi-generational households, that will dampen the demand for new housing. It will also change the kind of housing we need. So this is a trend we need to pay more attention to that nobody really is, at least yet. Now, when I was in Atlanta between 1988 and 2002, I and the rest of you went through a tremendous explosion in suburban development. Some of it good, some of it bad, but it was what it was. Why did it happen? A very large reason for why Atlanta, Dallas, and Los Angeles, and Vegas, all those places boomed in terms of housing demand was that we had the perfect crime taking place. So, you know, the perfect crime meaning we had the motive of the population. The motive was we had families, we had children, we needed space. Motive and means, we had the means, money, we had jobs, we had incomes. Many of our families had 2 wage earners, sometimes 3, but usually 2. So we had the motive and the means and the opportunity, meaning the home builders gave us great products and great locations and great designs at great prices. All these 3 things combined to result in the baby boom population between 1985 or thereabouts through 2005 or thereabouts, flooding the market with demand for homes. And we met that demand. Thank you very much. So in the time period 1995 to 2000, in the U.S. and Atlanta, virtually all the demand for new housing was to serve the baby boomers who needed the space, who had the money, and had the opportunity. Now we're seeing a decline in that bubble. Now we're seeing that the baby boomers have run their course in housing demand, and the generations behind them, the Generation X, the Generation Y, the new millennials, they're much smaller in number, and they're much smaller in aggregate demand, and they have different things that they want in their homes and neighborhoods. Okay, I'll touch on that in a couple minutes. Now, this complex chart shows median household income from 1975 annually to 2010. We're looking at this period here was the peak housing demand period for this nation and for this metropolitan area. We had the money, we had the family needs, we had the opportunities, and that's run its course. That's run its course. In 2010, we ended the 2000s in 2010 with lower per capita, with lower household income than we started the 2000s. Actually, it was lower than even 1997. It has not come back, unfortunately. It's not going to come back for maybe 10 years, according to economists I talked to. Now, what does this mean? When we look at the, I don't know if I can go, let's see, go back. Oops. Marissa, I messed up. Okay, there we go. So, this is the peak demand for, this is mature demand for housing. Mature demand is that households between 35 and 64 moving through the market in the 1980s to 2000s. This was their share of market demand. The peak demand for housing, age 35 to 64, peak income, largest home size, household size, everything else, that peak demand between 2010 and 2030, right there, that peak mature demand for homes will be 13%. 13% of the entire demand for new housing to 2030. Used to be 85%. Now it's 13%. So we need to be cognizant of these shifts in demographic demands. Starter home demand will be 10% of all net new demand, and the aging population, 65 and over, they will be 77% of the new demand for housing between now and 2030. These are facts, and these are changing America's housing demography in ways that we still haven't figured out yet. Maybe some have, I have not, maybe you have, but these are things that are facing us. In addition, we're looking at changes in household composition. Between 2010 and 2030, only 10% of the net growth in households will have children in them. 10%. Now, we'll have more children in 2030 than now, more households with children in 2030 than now. But they'll be only 10% of the net change in overall housing demand. 90% of the net growth in housing demand in 2030 will be to accommodate households without children, and 43% of that, of the total, will be single-person households. This is a brand new housing ballgame, and we are way out to lunch with our zoning codes and planning, because this is the future, and our zoning codes are based on a reality that no longer exists. We're also changing in terms of our ethnic composition. We are a nation principally of white Caucasians, but our share of the growth will be only 25% between 2010 and 2030. 75% of the nation's population will be attributable to minorities over the next 20 years. I'm not sure that we fathom what that means. Now, in terms of housing, I worry that we're not able to deliver home ownership opportunities to minority households. We haven't done a very good job. We tried. We haven't done a very good job. And now we're looking at minority populations simply dominating household growth over the country over the next 20 years. This particular chart shows annually the percent of homeowners by the major ethnic groups and also by whites. Notice it just hasn't changed all that much. Well, if we're adding more and more minority households to the population, and we see that their ownership rates are stagnating at about 40 to 50%, what does that tell us for the future home ownership rates for this country? It's probably not very positive. In addition, owning a home requires money. Money is based on education, skills, the ability to earn money. We are not doing a good enough job in our public school system, in my view, to prepare minority households, minority children, I should say, for the future. So minorities will not have the education or training they need to have the incomes they need, that we need to have them have to be able to buy homes between now and 2030 and beyond. This particular chart shows the gap between Hispanic education level in reading compared to whites between 1975 and 2004. I've got more current figures, and it's basically the same trend. Now, we will look back to the 2000s as the glory days of public education. We're now seeing education cuts. I saw in the paper yesterday morning, where we're seeing teachers being fired in the metropolitan area here on furlough, shortening school years, and so on and so forth. We are shortchanging our education so that our kids of all racial groups are not going to be learning as much as they need to earn the money they need. We need to have them earn to buy homes. This is going to cause us to have a declining or eroding homeownership rate. My estimate is that by the year 2030, we will be lucky to have a 63% homeownership rate. We're 65%, give or take now. We'll be declining to about 63% by 2030, and we'll be lucky. I think that my numbers indicate that we'll be down to 60% homeownership rate by 2030. Well, what does that mean? Well, here's another chart projecting. Actually, here's the peak homeownership rate, 2005, 69% homeownership rate, artificially high. I have to tell you that in 2005, our cat, Valentine Nelson, got in the mail a pre-certified offer for a $200,000 loan at better rates than we had. Well, my cat didn't buy a home, and as a consequence, the economy went to heck. Then she died on it. So for the nation, if we're moving from 65, 66% homeownership rate in now 2010, 2012, and moving forward to 2030, what do we see in terms of the split in demand for new housing by tenure, by owner and renter? So if we held home ownership rates for all the ethnic groups constant based on 2010 levels, but recognizing that our composition of our population is changing, that means that between 2010 and 2030, nationally, half of all new housing built would be built for renters. But that's optimistic. If we look more realistically to say that maybe there's going to be a 5% reduction in home ownership rates across all groups. That means moving our home ownership rate from 66% in 2010 to 63% in 2030. That means that 65% of the demand for new housing in the U.S. would be for rental housing. But there's a more realistic trend that these are my numbers, I worry about, about my numbers coming true. What if we see a 10% adjustment in home ownership rates across all groups? That means moving the average in 2010 from 66% down to 60% by 2030. The numbers are there. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac might be gone. Underwriting requirements are horrendous. I'll give you a situation. We moved from Atlanta to Alexandria in 2002 and sold our home in Dunwoody and made some money on it. Actually, according to Zillow, that home was now worth less than what we sold it for in 2002. We bought a home in Alexandria and made money on that home, thank you very much. Sold that home in 2008. We've been very lucky. We bought a home in Salt Lake City, a nice home, nice view of the Wasatch Range. We put 70% down, 70% down, and my credit score is over 800. But the bank calls me 5 days before closing in 2008, and the banker says, "Sorry, Dr. Nelson, we have to reprocess your loan because the underwriters have red flagged it." Wait a minute. 70% down, 800 credit score, and you're reprocessing my application? "Sorry, Dr. Nelson, but technically you don't start work at the University of Utah for 2 more weeks." So because I was without a job for 2 weeks in June of 2008, I had to have my loan reprocessed. They did so, and we closed on time. But if I have this difficulty buying a home in this market, what about people like Dan Reuter? Now, metropolitan Atlanta is a little better off than other places around the country, thank you very much. But you're still looking at these same kinds of trends. My guess is that between now and 2030, more than half, 60% even, of the net new demand for housing in the metropolitan area here will be for rental housing. And we actually see on the front page of USA Today, for those who live in hotels like I do, we see that there's a front page article that talks about renting homes. Now, we're not going to build apartments fast enough to meet the rental demand. What's going to happen is that millions of single-family owner-occupied homes will flip to renter-occupied homes. It's already happening. We all know that. It's going to happen even more. Now, a large part of all of these changes taking place are attributable to people like me, baby boomers, aging along. So we need to look at what about the impact of the baby boom population on housing demand in the future. This particular chart shows the number of seniors in the U.S. between 1970 and projected to 2040. And you can see right here a big steep increase in the number of seniors because the baby boomers are turning 65. They'll turn 65 between 2011 and 2029. And that is this curve right here. Now, I did a study on this among my 300 articles that I've written. I've got one coming out that basically says that when you turn 65, you don't die. And as the baby boomers turn 65, they'll be turning 65 in increasing numbers. And oh, by the way, anybody who's 65 today can expect to live to be 90 or more, according to actuarial tables. So as more of us are turning 65, we're also living longer. Social Security will be bankrupt by 2033 unless we fix it. And I'm not sure how we can fix it. There's other studies that indicate that by the year 2020, we will know with pretty good certainty how long the typical American can expect to live. My guess is 110. We already see actuarial tables. I used to sell life insurance when I went to college in the dark ages in Oregon in 1970, 1975. At that point in time, life insurance actuarial tables went to 100. Nobody lives beyond 100. You know, if you went to 100, you got front page news, national newspapers. Now it's routine. Now the actuarial tables for insurance companies go to 120. What do they know that we don't know? It used to be the case that IRS, when you cash in your IRAs, IRS said you would have to drain your IRAs out over a certain period of time. It used to be 100 years, up to 100 years of age. Now the formulas say you've got to drain your IRA out by the time you reach 113. What do they know that we don't know? I think that what's going to happen is by the year 2020, we will know with relative certainty how long we can expect to live as a matter of routine. Is going to be something north of 110 years. That's going to have interesting implications for retirement and Social Security and IRAs and the rest of it. Now, as we look at the kinds of people who buy and sell homes, this particular chart developed by Dal Myers at the University of Southern California, a good friend of mine, this shows the propensity for people at 5-year age cohorts to buy or sell homes. Now, as we start families, we're buying and selling, we're moving from our starter home to our larger home, and so we peak in our propensity to buy homes in the late 30s or thereabouts, and then our propensity to buy homes tails off as we get older. Our propensity to sell homes peaks a little bit in our 30s as we're buying and selling to move up, flattens out, and then look what happens in the late 60s. In the late 60s, more of us will begin to sell our homes than we're buying homes. As the baby boomers turn 65 and move towards 70, by mid-decade, we will begin to see in this country the markets flooded even more than they are now with people selling their homes. So between 2015 and 2040, roughly speaking, we will see the nation's largest glut of homes for sale than we've ever seen in the entire nation's history, more so than now, because of these factual characteristics. Now, Dal Myers also put together a chart showing that by 2020, across the U.S., across each state, the relationship between buying demand and selling demand. So what this chart shows here is that this zero line means that if you're in a state that's on the zero line, like I forget what state that is, but basically you have a situation where you have as many buyers of homes as sellers of homes. That's okay. If you're in a state, as Georgia is, above the line here, that means you have more buyers for homes than sellers of homes. That's a good thing. But if you're in a state, most states are in this situation, you'll have more sellers of homes than buyers of homes. That is not a good thing for value. I'm writing a book for Island Press. It'll be out next fall. And it's looking at a lot of things. And one of the things I'm looking at is the extent to which parts of this country will have homes that people will simply walk away from. In Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, parts of Wisconsin, upper New York, upper Pennsylvania, parts of Vermont, parts of New Hampshire, in many states across the country, people simply will not be able to either sell or rent their homes. They'll simply have to walk away from them. But you can't really walk away from your home because you still have liability for that home, right? So what do? Maybe you burn it down. So be aware of this growing trend across the country when you find mysterious home fires going on of vacant homes where people have already left. The smarter people, if they can afford it, will simply bulldoze their homes down. That's a new definition of empty nesting, I guess. So when a senior moves, what did they move from and what did they move to? Now, seniors, those over 65, as a group, own homes at the highest rate among all age groups in this country. 80% of people over 65 own their homes. 20% rent. Seniors are also stable. They don't move much. Among all the age groups, their movement is like 3% per year, compared to 7 to 8% per year for the rest of the population. So they don't move, they're stable, and they own homes. But when they move, they make a really big change. So according to the American Housing Survey, before a senior moves, only 20% of seniors before they move rent. But when they move, 60% rent. When did they start moving? 2015 through 2040. We're going to move from here to here. So we need to be preparing ourselves for this movement, this mass movement in housing demand among the seniors. So with all of this, we have to, we all know that housing markets are changing, the subprime mortgages are history, thank goodness. We're also looking at new underwriting requirements and the new banking rules coming out. I don't know if they've been implemented yet. Banking rules are requiring basically the 20% down payment. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac on the chopping block. Obama wants to get rid of them and sort of House Republicans. So their only disagreement is when. So we're looking at a housing market where we'll see smaller homes and maybe more people per home, smaller lots, more attached units, and more renters. I mean, we've already seen this happening, but we're probably seeing more of this happening in a more sustained pattern. Marissa, okay, it got stuck. Okay. In addition to all of these demographic changes, we have things like energy costs. This particular chart shows the median price of gasoline in the U.S., national average, from 2002 to 2012. A little dip for the recession, but basically it's a remarkably consistent straight line. An R-square of 0.82, meaning it's basically a prediction line. Gasoline prices are rising at 10% per year compounded. 3 or 4 times faster than income. I moved to the University of Utah. We were lucky this year. For the first time in 4 years, we got a 1% pay increase. But we're looking at gasoline prices going 10% per year compounded increasing. We also know that Americans have a difficult time buying cars. The average age of the car in place today is 11 years. The highest average in the nation's history since the data were collected. People holding on to cars longer because they can afford to buy new cars and the rest of it. As we're looking to the future, by the year 2020, according to the trend line, we'll be looking at $8 per gallon gasoline. By 2030, $20 per gallon gasoline. Well, we can fix that, of course, we can buy hybrids. The Chevrolet Volt, for example, today costs more than a Mercedes. So how many people realistically will be able to move from their clunker they have now that they can't sell to buy a hybrid to shelter themselves from the gasoline prices. Not many of us. Most of us can't afford the kinds of hybrids on the market today. So we're looking at this change another change in reality for the future. In many metropolitan areas, for instance, including Atlanta, lower and middle income households spend more money on transportation than on housing. And that's just going to get worse. I do not know. Okay. Now, what does all this mean? You've seen it locally, you've seen this nationally. The home values have taken a hit. It's not just because of one particular thing. Certainly we had the run-up in housing values in the 2000s for a lot of good and bad reasons. We have demographic changes, shifting housing demand situations, changing energy costs, overbuilding in certain markets, all the rest of it. What this chart shows here for the metropolitan Atlanta area is that homes basically inside the perimeter lost roughly 30% of their value between the high in 2007, 2008 to the low 2011. We all know this. Just outside the perimeter, 40% hit, and then beyond the perimeter, the outer tier, which is what I would call basically a 50% hit. Home values inside the perimeter, I think, from what I read anyway, are recovering. Just outside the perimeter, they're holding their own, probably going to recover over time. But the homes out in the outer tier counties, Newton County and so forth, are probably never going to come back in value. This particular chart that you already have in your handout shows, using Zillow.com, the change in values from the market peak to 2011 for these various submarkets. Inside the perimeter, roughly 30% loss. Recovering some now. Outside in the fringe counties, lost about half. Those values are probably not going to come back. But I want to point out something here. Fayette County kind of out there quite a ways. Peachtree City only lost 15%. So I think that there might be some opportunities for us to take some lessons, that even if we build farther out than inside the perimeter, if we have an attractive product, nicely designed, that has market appeal, we can we can protect against downside risks. So this is the second home we own in Atlanta. It's in Dunwoody. Dunwoody is the state's most affluent suburb, right? So we bought our home in 1989, lived there for several years, and sold it to some people. Then we learned from some former neighbors of ours, that our older home in Dunwoody, the owners couldn't sell it. They could not find a buyer to buy the home. And so they rented our former home in Dunwoody. This is happening all across the country, and we all know that. What we don't really know is that, oops, no, I'm kidding. Marissa, I need to go back. Thank you. This is a piece of America's future housing market, turning McMansions into multi-family housing. And here's how you do it. So a typical Atlanta, this is Atlanta, typical Atlanta McMansion is 3 floors, 1, 2, and a basement, a daylight basement, usually. 6,000 or so square feet. So we take the main level, see, that's the main level here. We have Grandma and Grandpa living in their master bedroom suite on the main floor. We have the large great area, large kitchen, a large socializing area. The center daughter who can't find a job after graduating from Georgia has to live here. Did I say that? I can say Utah State, where I'm from. So they're occupying the library again, because that has another bathroom attached to it. Upper floor, we have the master bedroom suite. We have a couple bedrooms. The nursery. This nursery is larger than the master bedroom my wife and I had in our first house in Oregon. So we have a whole other family that live up here. Basement, this exercise room turns into another master bedroom, Jack and Jill bathroom situation. 15 people, 3 or 4 families can live in this structure and have more square feet per person than the average family had in 1970, which wasn't a bad year. There are oftentimes more bathrooms than bedrooms. I grew up in a house in the suburbs in Oregon where we had 1 bathroom for 5 people. Here we have almost as many bedrooms as we have bathrooms. A typical American McMansion. Now this is already happening across the country, usually informally, because this is happening in violation of zoning codes and or homeowner association rules. So it's happening informally. I think we need to come to grips with the reality that we need to convert these homes into multifamily housing. After all, they are pre-built for multifamily housing. We need to find a way to make these available rather than relying on the underground market to do the same thing for us. I need to go back. Thank you. So what about changing preference patterns? What we're finding in this country is that people's preferences for neighborhoods and homes are changing. What we're now finding is that, maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we didn't think twice about driving long distances to work because gas was cheap and we enjoyed the commute, at least part of it. Actually, we need to come to grips with this because there's a piece of behavior we don't really understand. The commute by people is oftentimes the only separation a person has from their family and their job. It's their only personal time is in the car commuting. So sometimes commuting is a socially good thing. But what we're finding is that now the price of gasoline and other characteristics are having Americans think twice. And what we're finding now from the National Association of Realtors is that 60% of Americans would trade off. They would abandon the large home on the large lot if they got, for a small home on a small lot, if they cut their commute in half, from 40 minutes to 20 minutes, according to this chart. Now, the NAR survey done in 2011 actually started off with one important question. It asked the respondents, right now, today, what kind of home do you want to live in? 80% said single-family detached. Then the NAR survey, National Association of Realtors survey, goes on to showing people different trade-offs between neighborhoods and commuting and homes and everything else. And what we find is that, yes, people want to have the single-family detached home, but given options or alternatives, many of us will gravitate towards something a little differently. So a key element of what we now want in our neighborhoods is walkability, the ability to walk to grocery stores, to pharmacies, to other opportunities. Now, I used to build homes in the dark ages of the 1970s and 80s, and I still do advise home builders all around the country. Being able to walk places was simply not in the understanding of markets in the 1970s and 80s or even 90s. What we're finding now is that more and more people want neighborhoods that can walk within, and they want to be able to walk to destinations within their neighborhoods. In 1990, Sally Salter, an Atlanta Journal-Constitution reporter, she called me at my home and she said, well, Dr. Nelson, can I ask you something about sidewalks? I gave her an hour-long tutorial over the phone on the history and construction and social benefits of sidewalks. Now, what was happening at the time was sidewalks 20 years ago were a big issue in metropolitan Atlanta because most suburban Atlanta jurisdictions, well, 15, yeah, I'm good, thank you. Most suburban Atlanta jurisdictions prohibited sidewalks. If a developer wanted to build sidewalks in their subdivision, the zoning codes prohibited sidewalks. So this was a big issue 20 years ago. So I lectured Sally for about an hour and a half. Next morning's paper, Dr. Nelson says sidewalks are a good thing. My hour-long tutorial, I guess, didn't sink in as much as it should. When we left Atlanta in 2002, we left at a time when suburban Atlanta jurisdictions were raising their own taxes, floating bonds to retrofit their streets with sidewalks. So we're finding more and more people want to have walkable communities. Help. And part of that also means that people want to have more things in their neighborhoods than just a single-family detached home. They want a variety of different kinds of homes. They want to be able to live in one home this year, next year, 5 years from now, but be able to move from that home to another home, bigger or smaller, in the same neighborhood. That's called a smart growth community. Walkability, housing choice, a pleasant design, and the rest of it. What we find from surveys is that half of American households want vibrant, mixed-use kinds of neighborhoods. We also know that about a quarter of Americans want to be able to walk or ride their bicycle to work or for errands. As we have technical difficulties, okay. I guess my time's cut off, now I've got 12 more minutes. Here we go. So a quarter of Americans want to be able to walk or bike to work or for errands. Okay, here we go. I do not know what's going on. Thank you. So, what is the revealed behavior? Now we know from survey research, the biggest problem we have in survey research is what's called respondent bias. If you ask me a question, I'm going to answer it the way I think you want me to answer it. I won't tell you the truth. So, what we try to do is we try to ground truth responses by reality checks. So here we see the demand for people walking or biking to work. We see that 22% of the people want to walk or bike to work or for errands. Only 4% walk or bike to work. Only 10% walk or bike for errands. According to the National Household Travel Survey for 2009, so behavior belies survey responses. This would be an indictment on the survey, except that if we look more carefully, if we subdivide the National Household Travel Survey into distance, if you live within a mile of where you work, 25% of us would walk or bike to work in 1995. 37% of us did in 2009. The trend is huge. A 45% change in just a dozen years, not even, about 14 years, in walking or biking to work. But same trend for walking or biking for errands. In other words, more and more people will reveal their behavior in walking or biking to work or for errands, given the opportunity. So what this tells me as a planner is, and urban designer, let's design our communities to create more opportunities to walk or bike to work or for errands. Because then if you build them, people will use them in increasing numbers. If you run these numbers, if you run these trends actually, if all Americans lived within a mile of work and within a mile of errands, if all Americans did that, we would be actually hitting the Kyoto greenhouse gas protocols today. I'm going to skip over this. We get the idea. I'm going to skip over that. Okay. Another feature of behavior is that we know that roughly a quarter, not half, not 2/3, not all, but about a quarter of Americans want to be able to live within accessible distance, walking or short drive, of transit, fixed guide rail transit, MARTA or bus rapid transit or light rail or streetcar. 25% of Americans want to live accessible to transit. Now, not that they use it. They just want the option. So if we look at the Metro Atlanta share of population living within a half mile of transit, that's a standard accessibility distance, we see that 3% of Atlantans today live within a half mile of transit, of fixed guideway transit. 25% of us want to have that option, 3% have the option. If we look to 2030, 7.4 million people in the metropolitan Atlanta area, and we say 25% want to have transit accessibility, that means that 90% of all new homes built between now and 2030 would have to be within a half mile of transit. And then we might meet the demand for transit accessibility. This number is replicated all across the country. I'm not picking on Atlanta, it's the same thing all across the country. But this is also something that metropolitan areas are retooling themselves to try to take advantage of. Now, solutions for Atlanta would include things like, well, extending MARTA out to more places, but that's very expensive. Not alone politically charged, but it's very expensive. Much more affordable options are bus rapid transit, light rail, streetcar. These are things that many metropolitan areas are already getting into. Metropolitan Salt Lake City has all four of these major, all three of these, actually four modes under construction simultaneously. Commuter rail, light rail, bus rapid transit, and streetcar. And we know that by 2030, we still won't meet the demand for people living within a half mile of these opportunities. But the demand is there. I guess you have a ballot measure coming on later this year that addresses part of this. I'm not going to speak for or against the ballot measure, but these are the kinds of things that metropolitan areas are gravitating towards to maintain global competitiveness, let alone meet local market demands. Okay, I'm going to talk about the kinds of homes people want to live in. Between 1995 and 2004, there were about a dozen surveys, preference surveys around the country, asking people, what kind of home do you want to have the opportunity to live in? Single-family detached or attached or apartments and so on and so forth. I looked at all these surveys, and these surveys were done not by planners. I wouldn't trust a planner survey. These were done by builders, ULI, NAHB, NAR, and others. What I found was that 38% of Americans wanted to have the opportunity to live in an attached product. Townhouse, condo, apartment. 37% wanted a small lot under 1/6 of an acre, and 25% wanted the larger lot, over 1/6 of an acre. RC Elco, a very well-known market analysis firm, 2 years later they basically said, well, is Dr. Nelson right? At their own expense, they surveyed people all across the country, and they looked only at people who wanted to buy products. I looked at surveys looking where people, renters and owners, wanted to live. RC Elco looked at buyers only and found basically the same distribution.
Chris, what year were those surveys done?
Mine was a collection of surveys between 1995 and 2004. RC Elco was 2007. And the National Association of Realtors was 2011. And look what they came in at, between owners and renters. So basically, 3 different surveys, using 3 entirely different techniques, say the same thing. So this is the demand. What's the supply? Supply comes from the American Housing Survey. 28% of Americans' housing stock is attached. 29% is small lot, under 1/6 of an acre. And 43% is large lot. So we have, here's the demand, that's the supply. So this tells volumes to me about why housing values are eroding so much in many parts of the country. Not all, but many parts. And here's a graphic representation. In 2009, we had about 40 million more homes on large lots than the market demanded. So I'm going to wrap up here with just one more couple of comments. Where do we go from here? This is a Metro Atlanta shopping area, strip center, outside of, this is on Memorial Drive. This is our future. Embrace the future. These shopping centers, shopping areas run about 150,000 acres across the metropolitan area. If we can convert these things into the mixed-use developments along transit corridors where the market is headed, we could meet all of the Metro Atlanta's housing needs through this process. I am not able to advance. Okay, I'm gonna jump through this. I will talk about, back one please. One highlight I want to make here is that I'm actually surprised about the performance around MARTA rail stations. For the most part, these rail stations are very successful, but on average, I'm surprised that they only average 21 workers per acre within a half mile of the MARTA rail stations. That's lower than suburban office parks. We average 4.5 households per acre within a half mile of MARTA rail stations. That's lower density than suburban subdivisions. So I don't know what's going on, but I think there's a lot of opportunity around MARTA rail stations to meet future market needs by more wise or more intensive development. Let's go fast forward. I'm sorry. Forward. Forward. Yeah, I don't have time to go over this, but I wanted to leave some highlights with you. My generation, the baby boom generation, some of you as well, our reality, our preferences are very different from the next generation. For example, when I went to school, I anticipated a 30 to 40-year career in one area, maybe one job, but certainly one area. Our daughter is now looking at year-to-year employment changes within her broad field. She's figuring out how to be good at multiple things across time. Cheap gas is gone. We all want transit. The NAR survey, when we sliced and diced the demographic profiles, we found one particular group that was the most ticked off about their current situation. We call them the suburban Hummerites, the ex-urban Hummerites. The ex-urban Hummerite owns an acre lot and they own an SUV that they can't afford. They can't afford either of them. But they don't want to move to where light rail might be. They want light rail to be built out to where they live. Next slide, please. So on the last page of the slide, you have some bullets that I recommend in terms of things to do, things to watch for. Next slide. So thank you all very much. Now, yesterday we couldn't see it, right? But Venus transected the sun. 2 years ago, Jupiter came as close to Earth as it had been since 1962. In Salt Lake City, I went to my porch and shot Jupiter with my handheld camera against moons. So I'm showing it off. Thank you all. I can't very much.
Thank you, Chris. I think Chris delivered on what we promised. A lot of relevant, timely, interesting information.